Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sarah Rosenwortel with the great honor of being the president of the Urban Institute and of welcoming you all today. So first, let me do a quick couple of housekeeping notes. Although we got to be used to this by now, this event is being recorded and we'll make the recording and relevant links all available online after the event. If you're in the audience, you are muted. We have closed captions turned on. If you'd like to adjust your settings, you can click the live transcription button at the bottom of your page. Also, please, we encourage you to type your questions or comments into the question box at any time. We don't have much time, but to the best I can, I may weave some of them into the conversation. And even if not, it helps all of our panelists to know what you're thinking about, and it helps us shape our programs in the future. And please, we'll also share in the chat a post-event survey. Those are really helpful to us. We want your feedback. Finally, I encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter. Please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban so you can join with everyone else who's thinking about the questions raised by our terrific panelists. So many of the horrors of these last 16 months have simply revealed what lies beneath the surface and is in fact the lived experience for some of us every day. Just one chilling example of that is the extent to which since last March, we have seen incredibly disturbing, unabashed racism and xenophobia, and a surge of race-based violence towards Asian American Pacific Islander communities here in the US. And so many of these appalling and shameful incidents echo and perpetuate ingrained and negative tropes around Asian Americans being forever foreigners who somehow don't truly belong as Americans, even though we know the opposite to be true. With this backdrop in mind, the Asian American Foundation launched this spring to serve the AAPI community and the many AAPI communities to advance a reality free from discrimination and violence based on race, offering true visibility, recognition, and inclusion, and with stronger collaboration and coordination between AAPI organizations and between them and with other historically marginalized groups. At the Urban Institute, my colleagues and I were so pleased to have a chance to work with them to conduct a national landscape study of AAPI nonprofits that we are releasing today to better understand the breadth of their work, the challenges they face, and the investments and solutions they need. And my deep thanks to the Asian American Foundation for the opportunity to be part of this work and host this event today. We're going to drop a link to the report in the chat, and we'll also share it with all of you via email afterwards as well. In today's conversation, we're going to be focusing on policy and the poorly understood ways in which federal policy hinders but could better support the needs of the many diverse AAPI communities. We're also going to touch on the essential tools, such as disaggregated data, that are required to increase AAPI visibility across society, to inform and influence all of those who shape and influence policy, from the grassroots advocate to the academic, from the special interests to the policymakers themselves. Informing our conversation will be the work that Urban Institute's new Race and Equity Analytics Lab, or REAL, has been doing to help better inform policymakers about the very diverse experiences of all of us in America. REAL is a new initiative seeking to provide tools and expertise in modes of race-explicit analysis that can equip equity-focused changemakers with real-time data to design and advance race-conscious policies. And so to talk about all of this, we have an extraordinary group of people. I'm not going to detail their amazing resumes, but I urge you to look at the events page on Urban's website, where both their bios and their Twitter handles are. Please, I'm excited to have them join me. Please turn on your cameras. We're welcoming Neil Kashkari, who's president and CEO of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, and I'm also proud to say a trustee of the Urban Institute. We have my old friend, Sonal Shah, president of the Asian American Foundation and former colleague. We have Maria Torres Springer, vice president of U.S. programs at the Ford Foundation, and Paul Watanabe, professor of political science and director of the Institute for Asian American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. So Paul, I'm going to start with you to provide the lay of the land. When we talk about AAPI communities, we're referring to an extraordinarily diverse group of people, about 7% of the US population, that's 23 million people who identify as Asian American or Pacific Islander, and they represent dozens of countries of origin, religions, languages, ethnicities. And the group is also the fastest growing racial and ethnic group in the US. Now, I know this is a huge question, but if you could just start us off with some top lines, what are some of the special challenges that members of these communities face? And how does that vary from all of the different sub-communities by immigration status, generation, ethnicity, and other factors that we're talking about here today?
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And I want to thank the Urban Institute and the Asian American Foundation. I've been able to skim their report, which is released today. And it's outstanding. One really focuses on what is the heart of the Asian American community, and that is the nonprofit organizations that serve it. And I really want to congratulate and thank you for having this particular opportunity to talk about these issues. For over 40 years, I have been talking about these issues, the socio-demographic realities, which you summarized to some degree, the history and the consequences of the racialization of Asian Americans. But I must say, since the Atlanta shootings in particular, I dare say that probably more attention is now being paid to these issues about Asian Americans and the Asian American community than maybe in the previous 200 years. So here's a real opportunity to educate ourselves about this, the nation's fastest growing racial group, of which I think less is known than any other. The facts of diversity, as you point out, the ethnic diversity, there is no simple thing as an Asian American. There are over 50 countries to which Asian Americans trace their ancestry. And their sizes, as you point out, over 20 million people trace their ancestry to, and they're the fastest growing population. They're little known before and still little known. Some of these facts that you have indicated are little known generally. And they have been largely invisible. That means Asian Americans have been largely invisible. And this has meant that the diversity extends to socioeconomic diversity as well. They are not a monolithic model minority. There is huge disparity in terms of incomes and educational attainment, poverty. They occupy some of the highest levels, for example, of income and educational attainment, and some of the lowest levels, and much of this reflects the disparities along ethnic lines, which you're going to talk about. And as you indicated, to understand and account for this diversity, we cannot rely simply on Asian American average statistics. They hide so much of this. And there's the need for disaggregated data, which I think we're going to talk about later in this discussion. But there have been ways, particularly legally and politically, when Asian Americans have been treated in similar fashions, despite the differences. The restrictions on citizenship have accompanied Asian Americans since they came here in the United States. They are a group that said when they first came here as immigrants in this nation of immigrants are denied as immigrants the right to naturalize. And this right to naturalize for people like myself, I'm Japanese American. People from Japan could not naturalize until 1952 in the United States. This is a little known factor that immigrants from Asia could not become citizens. They were aliens ineligible for citizenship. And of course, part of this has also meant exclusion. That is that first the Chinese were excluded in 1882, and then this extended broadly to all Asians by 1924. And then as targets of recent violence in Atlanta, it was Koreans, but a few weeks later in Indianapolis at the FedEx killings, half of the people who were killed there were Sikh Americans, and Thai Americans were attacked in San Francisco, and in New York, we've seen Chinese and other groups. So in other words, Asian Americans are united in some respects about these attacks about them, despite the fact that it was called the China virus or the Wuhan virus or whatever it may be. It highlights the need for a unified response amongst Asian Americans across ethnic groups, and an understanding that while Asians may be divided in their homelands, and the politics are one of often in conflict with each other, in some ways they're united in the United States by their treatment here in the United States as Asian Americans. And also the Asian Americans must recognize as they are people of color, and that race is historically, and that historically facing racism has been very much a part of their treatment here in the United States. And thus Asian Americans must join in solidarity with other racial justice efforts in the United States. So this is part of the challenge for Asian Americans, and I hope a good response to get us going on your questions.
That's terrific. Thank you so much, Paul. I want to bring Maria and Sonal in now because each of you are in the philanthropic sector, and yet you're trying to think about strategies to support these communities, given the diversity that Paul has so beautifully described. How do you think about the challenges of what it means to support an agenda that would advance Asian American well-being? Sonal, why don't you start us off? And thanks again for helping us be here.
Oh, Sarah, thank you. And again, thank you to the Urban Institute for the incredible work that you all do, and also for Paul for his great intro on this, because he sort of laid out a lot of facts. I think one of the things that we think about a lot is one, just understanding our communities, given the diversity of the community that we are, and who are we, and what are our needs, and making sure that we understand it, because the what you laid out in the beginning, the disparity in the highest and the lowest income members of our communities, I'm not sure most people can even name who they are and which those communities are. I think it's important that we understand that. We understand it within the AAPI community, but also within each of the ethnic groups itself, there are disparities. So understanding that matters. But we think a lot about how do we support the organizations, especially right now on the anti-hate incidents, and what do we need to do to strengthen the community's ability to respond, strengthen the community's ability to address the issues that they're facing. What happened in Atlanta? How do we make sure that victims are addressed, but also that we're addressing the anti-hate before it comes, so it's not we're not just in reaction mode. The second area is really supporting the growth of the organizations that have already been working in these communities. Only 0.5% of foundation resources go to Asian American AAPI organizations, and recognizing that lack of resources has also created a lack of a deep infrastructure that has the ability to address the needs in our communities, and making sure one of the things that we're doing, definitely the Asian American Foundation, is ensuring that there's resources available to the community, both ourselves making the investment and ensuring that there's more resources coming in to strengthen the nonprofit organizations, to give them the capacity to grow, and to make sure it's part of a broader racial coalition that we're working intersectionally with other organizations and other community groups to address the issues that we face in our communities. It's not always one versus the other. Actually, we're many times facing. And then finally, addressing the model minority myth, making sure people understand through data and research that some of the work that you all have done, that this is we need to understand what's happening in our communities.
Maria?
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to the Urban Institute and the Asian American Foundation for this extraordinary partnership. And as Paul mentioned, there certainly has been more attention, more awareness. And I think all of us on this call are now hoping that that leads to more and enduring action, right? And so when I was listening to Paul's description, also profound, and it's like the history of so much in 2 minutes. So thank you, Paul. It's very, very impressive. A couple of things also stood out to me in terms of the diversity. There's the diversity of different aspects of the AAPI community's identity, but I also think it's important to understand that there's a diversity in the history and the stories that are part of define the AAPI community. And so many of those stories, of course, are full of triumph and progress, but too many of those stories, too much of that history as well, is part of an extended history of discrimination and stereotyping and violence directed at Asian Americans in this country. And I think it's always important to understand and excavate that history if we are to transcend it. Because ours, of course, is a history that includes Chinese exclusion and Japanese internment. It includes xenophobia directed at South Asian and Muslim Americans after 9/11, and too many instances to count. But in addition to that, the other thing that we try to keep in mind as well at Ford is there's also the interconnectedness of the issues that the AAPI community faces. So when you look at what happened, of course, the horrors with the murders in Atlanta, those were, of course, inseparable from this history that I just discussed, the broader history of anti-Asian hate. But they are also inseparable from a global epidemic of violence against women. They're also inseparable from the inequality faced by workers who labor at the margins of our economy. And so really understanding both the history of the communities and their stories and the interconnectedness of the issues that we face, we think at Ford and in working with so many other partners is important to make sure that that the attention and the awareness that has been sparked by the events of the last several months really signal a long-term change versus a momentary blip in support of AAPI communities. Something does feel different, I have to say. There is more attention, there is more awareness, it's a more nuanced set of conversations. And that shift, of course, is welcome, but it's also belated. And so I think for all of us, it's carrying these two sentiments of hopefulness and wariness. But I hope that that wariness is one that translates, as in the discussion today, a set of actions, tangible ones, long-term ones, enduring ones, that really try to support all of the organizations that are lifting up AAPI people and their right to belong, to be heard, to be safe, to be valued in national conversations about policy.
Great, thank you. So Neil, you've been a federal economic policymaker in a number of different roles for some time now. And in all of those, you're thinking about economic well-being, not only system well-being, but all of those in the system and their effects. And in that, you've looked at the AAPI community and communities as part of each of those roles. And I'm curious how you think about that. How much is the AAPI community front and center in thinking about economic policy making, or is it not? And what should policymakers be keeping in mind? What are some of the central challenges you see from where you've been sitting?
Well, first of all, thank you, as the others have said, appreciate you having the conversation and inviting me to be part of it. I think a lot of what has been said, I totally agree with. I mean, Paul talking about the heterogeneity beneath the surface, that's tough as a policymaker. If we don't have access to the data, then we don't get to see that heterogeneity. And that can really lead us to make bad policy decisions if we don't have a grasp of those nuances. I'll give you one specific example. One of the goals at the Federal Reserve is to achieve maximum employment, as many Americans as possible gainfully employed and participating in our economy. A lot of the data that we look at are aggregates and they're averages. And we say, oh, look, the Asian unemployment rate is quite low. It must mean, therefore, that all Asians are working. Obviously, if you go beneath the surface, that is not, in fact, true. Here in Minnesota, we have a very large Hmong community, and that could not be more different than the Chinese community that's here, or the Filipino community that's here, or the Indian American community that's here. And getting to be able to pierce beneath that surface to understand that heterogeneity is not only important for the members of that community, but it's actually important for us making the right policy decisions for the nation as a whole. So I think first and foremost, most economic policymakers, I think their hearts are in the right place. They want to have an economy that's inclusive and that is capable and help having everybody fully participate in that. But then we are hamstrung by our lack of data and our lack of visibility to really know what's going on beneath the surface. And that's why a lot of us spend time out in communities to hear firsthand the anecdotes. What are people really experiencing? Because those anecdotes shed light that the aggregate statistics often miss. So that's one comment. Second comment I would make, and I think others have touched on it, there is this assumption that is flawed that Asians are doing just fine. We don't need to worry about them, right? We have to focus on other minority groups where on the averages are much worse. So we got to focus on those averages. And again, I think that just does a disservice to many members of these communities, and it leads to suboptimal policymaking at the national level when we really do need to understand the heterogeneity, because again, it's in all of our interests. If we can get everybody in our society fully participating, contributing, helping them reach their full potential, then we as a country will really be able to reach our full potential. And so I applaud the work that Urban is doing in this regard.
So I want to go back to both Paul and Neil for a short piece. We're going to turn to hate and some of the inclusion activities in a minute, but I want to talk about the economy for a second. We just had a pandemic and a pandemic-induced recession. Recovery, as we know, is very uneven. There's been massive efforts at federal policy made without the transparency that you're describing as to where to target aid in the ways that one might ideally like. I'm just curious if you have a couple sentences each of reflections about where the Asian American communities sit in this moment in the economy, and the recent legislation where it has maybe reached or not reached, to the extent you know. Neil, why don't you start, and then we'll come to Paul.
Sure. I mean, one area that we focus on a lot, they got a lot of it national attention for good reason, is the PPP program. Hundreds of billions of dollars Congress allocated to small businesses to help bridge them through the pandemic. Now, policymakers couldn't reach 1 million small businesses individually. We all, the SBA, the Treasury, the Fed, we had to work through the banking system. The flaw of that is you had to basically have a relationship with the bank. And so what we found, and this isn't unique to Asians, but we found many very small businesses, very many minority-owned businesses and immigrant-owned businesses did not have those existing banking relationships. And it was hard for them to access these programs, even just to get their fair share. And so that was a real challenge that I think policymakers faced. I think we got better at it over time. We had got CDFIs more involved who had some of those relationships. There were language barriers. You know, how do you fill out the form? What forms do you need? What documentation is required? And we did see nonprofits step up who had some of those relationships, but that continues to be a big gap that we need to work to bridge so that the next time something terrible like this happens, it's more seamless, and the people who the aid is intended to reach, that it actually reaches them.
Paul, observations on the economic situation right now?
Yeah, I think Neil's exactly right about some of the unique features, particularly of immigrant Asian American storefront businesses or small businesses in terms of accessing this aid. But there are other factors as well. For example, when the aid was originally presented, you couldn't get it if you were an undocumented person. And a lot of people say, well, that must have had a big impact on the Latino community. There are over 1.5 million, it's estimated, Asian Americans who are undocumented. So by that notion alone, you knock out a significant portion of Asian American population from eligibility for aid and support, et cetera. So Neil is absolutely right. And in the determination of the unemployment consequences, I see lots of different, depending on what sort of measures you use. Some indicate that Asian Americans probably have the highest long-term unemployment because of the pandemic than any racial group in the United States. And if you base, for example, your estimation of the employment effects on, for example, how many individuals went and sought trying to go to the state to get unemployment assistance, that's going to have an effect against Asian Americans. Many of them are family-owned businesses that rely on family-owned labor, for example, and many times when a person in that sort of business doesn't go to work, they don't go and seek government assistance. They either just simply go to school or fall out of the system, or they don't go to seek government support for that assistance. And many of them are in the underground economy, frankly, and they're not going to get assistance in these formal ways. So there are lots of ways in which Asian Americans in particular, as many other immigrant groups in the United States, are impacted by the way in which you actually get data. And that's why the thing that is stressed in the TAAP report, that we really got to look upon the community-based organizations who work and know these communities well as the way in which we understand what's happening in those communities. They on the ground, rather than maybe traditional mainstream government agencies, are the best ones to give us a sense of what's happening within these various communities.
One of the things I like about the points that you both made is how much better federal policy could be if there was richer understanding. I think much of to the extent there is analytic depth, and Paul, obviously you've made a career of this, about these communities, it has been understanding a lot about their social and political lives. And yet, I think the more granular analysis of how well different policies reach each of the diverse parts of the American experience is going to help us to make better policy. And it's why the executive order moment seems to us to be the president's, I'm referring to the president's executive order on racial equity and underserved communities, understanding how decision-making affects different communities seems to me to be another element that's unique about this moment. So I want to turn back to you, Maria, for a moment to talk a little bit more about what Paul so brilliantly said at the beginning, is the shared experience of these many diverse communities, the sad shared experience of othering, and what more as we think about whether it's federal policy or other actors can take on that. Congress passed the COVID Hate Crimes Act, but clearly there is a broader agenda. And I'd love to hear from both you and Sonal about some of the elements of an anti-hate agenda and a narrative change story.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. So whether it is public policy or a philanthropic funding strategy, and I start with there are some basic principles that are important in order to do this work well and to do it in a way that endures versus meets the contemporary set of challenges, as daunting as they are, but really doesn't build capacity for the future. And they're quite simple. You know, one starts, we've already discussed it today. What does it mean to have a granular understanding of the different AAPI communities? Starts with data, but it's not just, it doesn't just include that, but really having the type of reach across the many organizations who are on the ground serving AAPI communities, incredibly important. Two, ensuring that there is representation in all of the right decision-making roles, that it's not just one agency or it's not just one program officer, that it's really a whole of institution response. And as you mentioned, Sarah, the racial equity EO with the federal administration is a great example of how we can ensure that that type of approach is there. And it's also important to make sure that AAPI people are in roles where they are informing and making decisions. The third, addressing the interconnected issues, as I mentioned before. And then the fourth is making sure that we're not exacerbating the situation by siloing the work. And by that, what I mean is perpetuating a zero-sum dynamic in terms of resources, grant opportunities, attention, programs, because all of this fundamentally, these are all challenges faced by all marginalized peoples. And so really finding a way to do the work that supports collective efforts to upend inequality in all its forms and to end oppression for everyone, I think should always be part of the North Star. But more specifically for philanthropy, because I think a big part of this is what does it mean to work in partnership across sectors? And there's a lot that philanthropy needs to do and do more of in order to really partner as effectively as possible with AAPI communities. And it's so fantastic. And Sonal is leading such an extraordinary effort with the Asian American Foundation, and the funding community in general has a lot more work to do given the statistics, but I'll name a couple of areas that are particularly important for us. One is ensuring that we're actually funding the entire AAPI ecosystem. There are lots of different types of AAPI serving organizations, smaller grassroots organizations, more long-standing ones. Some are better able than others to accept and then use large sums of new funding. But what you don't want is a huge disconnect between activated donors, right, and opportunities that exist on the ground. The second is to fund it properly. This work, whether it is long-term narrative work, long-term civic engagement work, certainly any of the solidarity work, the cross-racial work, that doesn't happen overnight. It's not a project that can be done in 6 months. And so for partners, whether government or funders, to be able to provide the type of long-term flexible funding for this type of essentially relational work to happen is incredibly important and doesn't happen often enough. So those are the two pieces that I think are in the how of funding that I think are incredibly important. But let's be clear, there are headwinds that we face in this work, whether it's from a policy perspective or from a philanthropic perspective. The headwinds include, we are having this conversation, everyone doing an extraordinary amount of work, and the backdrop of what has become a backlash, right, out in the world on attacks, clearly poorly understanding what critical race theory is, but there is a brutal set of discussions out there, and CRT being banned, even if not understood in so many places. And so the ability to continue to do this work in a full-throated way, knowing that there are countervailing forces, is really important. And then the second, and I'll end here, as hopefully more attention continues, there's more funding for organizations, we resist the temptation to go back to or only resource the types of initiatives that are actually taking away attention and funding from groups on the ground. And that includes resources that are too much for kind of inside the beltway type of work. All of that is really important, and it's incredibly important to continue to fund and resource and interact with and understand, engage local organizations who've done so much, who've been at the forefront. Because otherwise, I think what we're doing, and it wouldn't be the first time that organizations have asked to be the safety valve for our democracy and for so many issues, but they're resourced to be parachutes versus the pilots in this work. And so I know we're all aligned in making sure that some of those dynamics don't get exacerbated.
So Sonal, you're at the beginning of a new initiative and been able to attract a lot of great resources, and now you have to craft strategy. And so many of the challenges that we've heard from Neil and Paul and Maria just now mean that there's tough choices to make about the priorities and where do you go first. Particularly, I want us to, in this moment, focus a little bit particularly about the narrative and the story and the capacity and the infrastructure. I know you and your board have not gotten to a final set of decisions on that, but can you share some of the considerations and where you're thinking about what the priorities ought to be ahead?
Yeah, Sarah, thank you. And huge thanks to Maria. Before I answer your specific question, I also wanted to just follow on with a comment that Neil made about the PPP and just an understanding, like the PPP was a federal program, but there needs to be that link between what a federal program is and how people experience a federal program. And that experience is sometimes what we don't think about on the federal side is how does somebody actually understand how to read what's on the website or where to get the information? And it's sort of written from a federal perspective, not a human perspective. The organization or the business owner, and I know a lot of them in Houston where I live, just didn't even understand how to access the information. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's language access, but sometimes it's just not even understanding what the language actually means. It's such federally crafted language that you have no idea what it means to sign up for something, or which bank do you go to, or how do you think about it? And there's nowhere to go to get those answers. So I think thinking through policies that actually think of it from the human side of this also helps to think through how we think about crafting policy. Who's reading it? What does it mean to them? We might want to think about doing focus groups with humans as opposed to just people who are reading it from the policy side. The way we're thinking about it, and we have 3 areas of work: anti-hate, education, and data and research, because as we've illuminated on this call, why it matters. But really, really thinking about it from like the side of the people in our communities. What do they need? How do we make sure, and I'm going to start with anti-hate because it's such an important piece as well as belonging, is what are communities facing on a day-to-day basis at the local levels? That is not getting access to resources, being kicked out of homes, and not having their leases renewed because they are Asian American, or families who are afraid to go get a vaccine because they're afraid what might happen if they go get a vaccine, or parents who are afraid to go outside. I have friends whose parents live in Chinatown who are too afraid to go outside and walk because they're afraid what might happen to them on the street. That's how we're approaching it. How can city, state, local officials work with communities to make sure people are feeling safer? How do we then look at the data to say, where are the incidents happening? What types of incidents are happening? What are the hate issues that are happening? How do we help address them? What are ways to do that? What are policies that can help address that? Who do we need to link to in law enforcement and other places in community organizing that make sure people know what's happening in those communities? So I think all of that matters. And then the narrative change piece of this is a reminder that Asian Americans are American first, right? We always tend to think of Asian Americans as a perpetual foreigners, whether we think about it of Japanese Americans in the incarceration that happened, World War II, or whether it is even today where we think just because you're Chinese American, you're linked to China first, your loyalty is to China as opposed to the United States. We have to recognize that the United States, that we are immigrants, but Asian Americans are also immigrants, and we did pledge our loyalty to the United States when we became American citizens. And when we are living here, we're not going back to our countries, we're here. And we're our countries of origin. I don't even know my country of origin. I grew up, my parents, I've been here since I was 4. So the question, I think, reminding people in education and other places. So 2 things I want to say, 2 good victories we've had. State of Illinois passed legislation this week that approved Asian American education as part of the teaching history. California has already passed that. And 2, most recently, the DOJ, looked at what was happening at Department of Commerce, targeting Asian American scientists and making sure that we are not targeting Asian Americans just because they're Asian American, but they're actually doing research for the United States. So I think there's work that we have to do, which is being vigilant on what is happening to our communities, helping build an infrastructure in our communities to respond to issues of hate, but also economic diversity, economic inclusion, so many other pieces of it. And then the last is ensuring that we are seen as belonging to the United States and not just as the perpetual foreigners.
Well, if the number of comments that we've been getting and questions we've been getting in the chat is any indication, clearly that the themes that each of you have hit upon is really touching a chord. So I'm going to do my best to try to cover them. We're probably going to go just a couple minutes later than 2:15. So first of all, Paul, I want to come back to this idea of disaggregating data. And there are a lot of comments in the chat for me that I thought were really interesting about the understanding the ways that different communities a program may be serving all of our communities. We touched on this with the PPP, but if you are Native Hawaiian, if you are Pacific Islander, if you are Hmong, if you are of Japanese origin, depending upon the length of duration of your history, are you a first generation? Are you U.S. citizens, many generations later? If you're a policymaker, how should you think about that? So, and obviously we've all said the first thing is you got to actually know that these policies affect those communities differently. That's the disaggregation data. And I'm going to turn to you, Neil, to ask about that challenge in just a minute. How do we do that? Or Paul. But I also want to ask you, from a policymaker's perspective, talk a little bit more. People really want to understand these different communities. What does it mean for the policymaker themselves?
Well, I can begin. For policymakers, it's critical. Think about, for example, health policy making. If you assume that all Asian Americans, if you look at aggregate data, you look at the aggregate data and it says Asian Americans are generally pretty healthy. If you stop the conversation there, then you deliver health benefits in terms of that response. But if you break down the data, you see, for example, that Chinese Americans, even despite not having a lot of the comorbidities or certain behavior, have higher levels of diabetes. That certain populations have higher levels of hepatitis, and that even some early data indicate that Korean Americans, surprisingly, had some of the lowest levels of enrollment in health insurance, for example. Now, those sorts of factors are going to impact policy in a big way, at least in terms of outreach about policy, how you inform people about what's available, what Sonal and Maria have talked about in terms of being able to reach populations about what's available to them beyond language access. And we think, for example, about, let's say you're interested in providing translation services in hospitals and so forth. Well, if you know that there are lots of Asian Americans in a particular area of the country or a particular jurisdiction, that may be helpful, but you want to know whether the languages you want to provide Are they going to be Chinese? Are they going to be Japanese? Are they going to be Korean? Are they Vietnamese? Are they going to be Khmer or whatever they are? Those are the sorts of things that in a very practical way, it seems to me, you're going to want to know disaggregated data. Schools, for example, that may want to run ESL programs or so forth. It helps to know that you're Asian Americans in a particular school district, but it helps to also know whether they're Vietnamese or Chinese, because you're going to provide school some sort of support. You got to know where to hire teachers that teach Vietnamese or Chinese. These are very practical considerations, I think, in terms of delivering this data, and they're seemingly very simple considerations, and often it's hard to get a sense of it, because getting a lot of this data means doing it in language, and I know that's expensive. And sometimes it's easier to say, well, maybe all Asian Americans are either insignificant in terms of their numbers, which is not true in many cases, or that they're all the same anyway. And that's the biggest problem of getting over that notion that they're all the same, and the initial notion that they don't have any problems, as Neil pointed out at the very beginning. A big problem for Asian Americans is the assumption that they don't have any problems. That's some of the biggest problem of all in terms of our perception of Asian American community.
So Neil, you've been a consumer of federal statistics for decades, and you're used to seeing these charts that, you know, always start with white as the norm, and then you get Black and Latinx variations, and then some category called other. We're obviously talk about disaggregating out of the other at these smaller sample sizes. But then the point Paul just made is that you've got to go a lot deeper to really understand populations in the United States. It's not just sort of pulling Asian American Pacific Island out of other, but really understanding that. Paul talked about expense. Once upon a time, collecting information at that level of granularity seemed hard because of the expense of doing so, but technology is different today. The private sector, Netflix knows more about us and more dimensions of our life than is possible. So as we think about the task of disaggregating data and what data science and research technologies have brought us, are you optimistic that this sort of granularity, not only of the Asian American community, there's similar granularity within the Black community and within the Latinx community and in many other dimensions, certainly of LGBTQ populations. So talk a little bit about the future that we could be looking for and hoping for here.
Well, I am optimistic, Sarah, for the reasons that you said. And I know some of the surveys that we conduct at the Federal Reserve, we are making an intentional effort to oversample, for example, certain groups to make sure that they are represented and we have a richness of information, because the numbers may be relatively low, but it's worth it to make that investment. But one of the challenges that's coming to mind as I'm listening to this conversation is we really see the limits of our knowledge when a crisis happens. But when the 2008 crisis happened, and I was at the Treasury Department, and we had lots of housing programs. In the Bush administration, in the Obama administration, they were all wonderfully well-intentioned, and they were all disappointing in their effectiveness, in part because we couldn't reach the people who really needed the help, despite everybody's best efforts. When you're in a crisis, whether it was the 2008 crisis, or now it's this pandemic, trying to get the PPP out, or now we're trying to vaccinate vast majority of Americans, how do you reach, whether it's language issues or it's trust issues or cultural issues? It's in all of our interest. Even if I'm fully vaccinated, and I am, thankfully, I want everybody else to get vaccinated so we can get control of this pandemic, and so that we don't create some variant that comes back and infects me. Well, it's very hard to solve these problems in the middle of a crisis. And so I think the work that you all are kicking off now is really important so that we can have some sustainability of the progress that we're making, so that the next time a crisis comes along, and there is going to be a future crisis, we are much better positioned to reach the people who we need to reach and not be scrambling at the last moment, as we always seem to be.
So I am going to ask each of you I'm looking at all of the comments in the chat. I think we could do this for another hour, but I hope this is the beginning of conversations, not the end. I'm going to ask each of you to think about this question about what would progress look like in advancing AAPI inclusion. And particularly here, we're talking about doing it in policymaking, but with real mindfulness that achieving policy goals on the ground absolutely means that you need to start from the bottom up, as both Sonal has said, when you're thinking about the individual's experience of policy. Maria has talked about the infrastructure that exists that served these communities for so long. So I'm asking each of you to sort of, Paul, you started us, so I'm going to ask you to end, but I'll start with you, Maria, and Sonal, Neil, Paul. If you could tell me, let's take 5 years. What do we want to have seen progress look like? What are we going to have accomplished? Know we're on track if 5 years from now, this agenda is kind of built into the policymaking process.
Mm-hmm. I'll say two things. One is mechanical, but not at all unimportant, and the other one is I'd say a little bit more aspirational, but I also think critically important. The mechanical part of it is that we are having a few years down the road, hopefully much sooner, a set of conversations amongst all of us who want to make a difference here, regardless of what sector, that is about how to use the data, that what happened in the use of disaggregated data, but we at least have it. There's at least a place where we have started and we're experimenting, improving on ways that type of data, that type of understanding of different communities is actually allowing us all to do our jobs better. And the actual job of that I hope we're all aspiring to is, if true progress I think is to be made, is one that completely understands and finally understands the different needs and aspirations of AAPI communities, but is really thinking about this in a cross-racial way, not exacerbating what have been the zero-sum dynamics that have kept us from fully living into the type of multiracial democracy that this country should be.
Sonal, I'm going to go to you next, but let me ask you to also pick up on the point Maria made, because we haven't talked about this as well as we might. There have been historic tensions, certainly between different communities in this country, and some of that has been fostered and set one against another in this sort of zero-sum way that Maria has talked about. So what does success look like on that and other dimensions of this agenda?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me start with that question specifically and where Maria left off, which is 100% agree with her that we need to make sure that we are working in a multiracial way. This is not one committee pitted against another community. It is not a zero-sum game. In order to build a multiracial democracy as the Asian American Foundation, but as Asian American as ourselves, we need to recognize that our progress is linked to everyone else's progress. It is not pitted against each other's progress. The reason the 1965 immigration bill, came together is because of the racial justice movement that took place and because of the civil rights movement. So we need to make sure we know we are interlinked, but that's why education also matters. We need to educate both our own communities, but also other communities about who we are and how our stories are actually very linked. So I think that's one. The second, the three areas that I want to add on to that are, one, making sure that this year, as our new census director gets confirmed, making sure that disaggregated data, especially about Asian American communities, is also a part of that conversation, that we're not back here talking about the same conversation 10 years from now, but this is normalized and that it's language, it's got in-language processing, so we can actually do it in the languages. Two is making sure people are in the right places, that we have Asian Americans in jobs in the federal government that can advocate for, but also remind people who the communities are and that their voices matter at that table as policies are being made. And then the third, as policies are being made, making sure not only the AAPI voices in there, but in the racial equity, racial justice space, that we are talking about this together. It's not one versus another, and we're not an afterthought, but this is a conversation of which AAPI communities are also at the same conversation.
And that means AAPI communities contributing and putting muscle into the racial justice agenda for Black and Brown community in order to build that trust. That's
absolutely.
Right. Neil.
In addition to the data that we talked about a lot, which I think should be achievable in a fairly reasonable period of time, there are a lot, as Paul said, there are large numbers of Asians in America, and they're not, in my opinion, they're not nearly as politically organized or active as other communities are. And if even a small percentage of Asians said, I'm going to participate in the political process, whether it's running for city council or the school board or higher office, or just getting involved in helping to set and drive the policy agenda, I think that could be very powerful in terms of where we go as a country. and making sure that their voices are heard and their considerations are at the table.
Great, thanks. All right, Paul, you started us off with an amazing overview. Can you end us with one?
Well, let me begin with a seemingly self-serving but important comment, and that is when they talked about the TAAAF and about the kinds of things that would support. One thing I was glad to hear, for example, is willing to support data production and research, because often there's a sense that we want to provide those who are offering services in the nonprofit sector, but research is something that's not really we're not delivering services. And I think that that's one of the great difficulties. I'm sure the Urban Institute feels this as well, that people say, well, you're not supporting really delivering services on the ground. And we are. And for entities like us to do the research, to provide the tools for nonprofits to do their work, it's critical that we get some funding from these entities. And it's very difficult for us to do so. On the broader question you made about racial justice and so forth, I think it's critical for us to understand. I think, for example, in Ferguson, Missouri, a few years ago, members of the white community in the police department were wearing buttons, and the button says, "I am Darnell Wilson." Now, who was Darnell Wilson? Darnell Wilson was a police officer who shot a young 18-year-old kid named Michael Brown in the streets of Ferguson a couple summers ago. And those people wanted to show their solidarity with Darnell Wilson, the person who committed the killing of Michael Brown. In my view, I think the beginning of, and what we must tell our Black brothers and sisters, indeed for all of us, that the beginning of understanding and the hope of eradicating persistent racism and debilitating inequities is when all of us who are white, yellow, black, brown, and all of us can say and proclaim together that I am Michael Brown, I am George Floyd, I am Trayvon Martin, I am Vincent Chin, I am Breonna Taylor, I am Ahmaud Arbery. I am not an illegal, I am not a virus, I am not a yellow peril, I am somebody. And Asian Americans are prepared to say we are somebody. We're tired of being shoved, we're tired of being shot at, we're tired of being spat upon, we're tired of being scorned. So part of the outcome of this is, I hope, in response to what Neil has put a challenge for us, is greater activism as well. There's fear and trauma in our community, but there's also greater willingness to break the invisibility that has impacted us and had negative consequences for us. And there's greater activism within our community, and we're not going to take it anymore, I hope. Thank you very much.
That was fabulous, you guys, all of you. Grand aspirations. I plan to reconvene far sooner than 5 years, but boy, would it be great if when we do this in 5 years, we can see that that there's real progress in all of those dimensions. Thank you to everyone who joined us here today. And thank you to my colleagues, too many to name, who contributed to put out the report that we did today, which was a real joy for us to do. And thank you, Sonal and TAAF, for your leadership in this space. Excited to continue this conversation. Join us again soon. Thanks, everyone, for being here.